All right, welcome to our next video, our sort of halfway point through these various chapters. I guess we're a little further than halfway through. And what I find to be one of the seemingly contradictory chapters in that it is both to me one of the most accessible at times and also most densely populated with sort of difficult to untangle ideas. Um, and so we'll see what we can do about untangling some of them. As with some other chapters, Jane Smiley, this is probably going to start sounding repetitive to you all, but Jane Smiley spends quite a bit of time talking about a number of novels and novelists here that I'm not going to spend a lot of time getting into the details of, because again, our intention here is not necessarily to take a deep dive of what she has to say about A Portrait of the Lady, or To the Lighthouse, or The Ambassadors, or In Search of Lost Time. Simply because if you haven't read those novels, um, a deep dive of what she has to say about them as particular specific texts is not going to be as useful. But again, I hope that you find the broad ways that she is thinking about what these novels accomplish and how they accomplish them in terms of the question of the art of the novel, is conceptually meaningful to you, even if it's not a novel that you specifically have a lot of context for because you haven't read it. So let's begin with what I'm calling just the novel timeline here, and I'm using the word timeline in a weird way. She once again kind of leads off her chapter with, I think, a really important point that historically most novelists that we still read today gleaned their know-how from other novelists. If we start all the way back with writers like Forster and James, Dickens, etc., at the time that they were writing, there really weren't, programs like ours where you could go to study the craft of writing. And that's partially because there was not necessarily, from the outset, a whole lot of question or concern with what we now would say are the craft components of writing. And she dips into what it means for these works to be art, quote unquote, throughout the chapter. But what novelists of the day did was they studied the work that came before them. And even though we now have programs, courses, opportunities for people to directly study how to go about writing their work in ways that these novelists may not have had, one of the things that we share with them is this importance of an awareness of who we are reading and what we are taking from who we read, right? And so this is why sort of having a sense of where your literary history is becomes so important, not only in terms of who are the writers that you are writing in conversation with just because you're writing similar things to them. If you write fantasy, you should obviously know who some other fantasy writers are, but also who are the writers that have driven you to write your stories the way that you write them, right? Because she tracks on that very first page. I'm not going to read it, but these lists of who read who, and you can, if you wanted to take the deep dive, you would be able to see how the fact that writer A read writer B, and you would be able to see how writer B informed writer A in terms of their approach to writing. But then there's this other directional thing that she says on the next page. Seminal novelists and others made a technical contribution to the art of writing novels, along with a contribution to the treasury of stories, settings, and characters. So not only did these writers leave behind these great stories, these memorable settings, these characters that are vivid, they left behind these technical contributions that she talks about throughout the chapter. And like she says on the next page, the novel requires technical innovation because there is simply no way to make the time pass and the characters exist within a particular setting without being inventive. So we are always inventing. We are always coming up with new ways of telling stories. And really, in a lot of ways, that's where the art comes from, right? Like, what does it mean for us as individuals to be artists? Is the individual and unique technical innovations that we each bring to the work that we're writing. And this question of technique, I think, is so important. One, she talks further down on that page, an author's technique grows out of a number of things. And we'll leave out the antiquated gendering of these pronouns here, just that as if this the only authors can be men. An author's technique grows out of their temperament, intentions, and ideas, but also circumstances. So we are all kind of subject to the when and where we live, right? The when in which we live, the where in which we live guides what we write, but so does our own mindset, as well as what we want to do, what we're trying to say, and what ideas we have. And a lot of this notion of technique and the way we approach doing things is driven by those things. And then I think the other thing that is important to mention is leaping ahead a few pages, kind of skipping her discussion of Tristram Shandy, is this idea that since no novel can simply exist, like a painting or a sculpture, but must communicate something intelligible, the ways in which it can be well crafted are numerous. And so I think this is, when you think about the art of the novel, there are endless numbers of ways of telling our stories, right? A painting can simply exist in terms of what the distinction that she means here is that a painting can be a visual painting, and it is up to the person who looks at it to create something out of it. But it can simply exist as a painting. A sculpture is this tangible thing that can simply exist. But a novel doesn't have that same capacity. It has to communicate information, right? There have to be understandable words put to page in some order that add up to an intelligible thing. But the ways in which we can do that are almost endless. If you are making a marble bust, for example, by contrast, you have to create a marble bust in a particular way. Or, there are probably several ways, but generally you have to use a particular way. If you are painting oil with oil paints, there are particular ways that you have to use oil paints to put together an image. Whereas, and although there are different techniques to use oil paints, there are far more different ways of communicating the intelligible thing in a novel. Now, most of this chapter is about the different kind of contentions about the role of art, what art can do. And we'll start our conversation or my overview of that with what she has to say about what Tolstoy has to say, one of the great Russians. On page 139, she writes that true art, Tolstoy asserts, would appeal to universal human thoughts, desires, and needs, would be simple to understand, would be inclusive rather than exclusive. And this question of inclusive versus exclusive kind of wends its way through much of this chapter and is, I think, very much tied to the questions of high gameplay and low gameplay that we looked at in a previous chapter. Tolstoy thought that art should be universally accessible, that we pull down the barriers between ease of getting into the heads of characters, understanding what is being communicated, whereas other writers like Henry James thinks that novels can be exclusive rather than inclusive. And as he says on page 140, as she says of him, others accepted James's basic idea that the novel was or could be exclusive rather than inclusive, and that a novel without much popular appeal could do things artistically that a novel with popular appeal could not. What this really got me thinking about when I was reading it is something that if you've taken the Linden Ways orientation course that we talk about in that class, at least briefly, is these questions between quote-unquote literary work and quote-unquote genre work. A distinction that nowadays has really started to fall apart, which I think is a good thing. But this gets a little bit at the larger question of, can something that is popular, and for a long time, the novels in the 20th and 21st century, the last 50 years that were popular were, mysteries, romances, suspense, those sorts of things, versus quote-unquote high literary art. And the walls between those have started to fall down. But there have long been these conversations and questions about, if something is vastly popular and accessible to lots of people, does it have high artistic value? And I remember, for lack of a better example, and that's all I'll say about this, is when I was a college student, this was a debate that raged around the Harry Potter series. Did J.K. Rowling's work, and whether or not you find J.K. Rowling to be problematic or not these days is not the point that I'm making here, but before all of that, was that book series artistically meaningful? Could something that had sold so many copies, that so many people found inviting and accessible and beloved, be of high artistic quality? Henry James would say no. Tolstoy would say yes, and that it should be. And so this is one of the interesting things, so this is what she says on page 141. This has this has sort of grabbed folks for a long time, for the rest of the 20th century, and even now into the 21st century. Novelists, readers, and critics continue to argue about what was artful in the novel. So, what is it that makes something artful? And this is one of the things that I hope many of you will talk a little bit about in your discussion this week. Is like, what does it mean for a story, for any piece of writing, really, to be artful, right? Are the Harry Potter books artful? Can you make an argument that 50 Shades of Grey is artful, that Colleen Hoover's novels are artful? And I'm not trying to bang on anyone who reads those or enjoys them, but what is it that makes something artful? Is it within the sentences that you write? Is it this ability to comment on life, to make statements about the human condition? Can it be about a theory? One of the things in this book, in this chapter in particular, when she, being Jane Smiley, talks about the goals of a passage to India and how it accomplishes what it's up to, what Virginia Woolf is attempting to do into The Lighthouse. How many readers, and I'm not trying to be insulting to any particular reader, but perhaps I'm saying something about the general population, would read To the Lighthouse and extract what Jane Smiley extracts from it? How many people would choose to read To the Lighthouse by choice over a romance novel? I don't know. And what is it that makes, in some people's minds, To the Lighthouse a work of art versus, take your pick, a Danielle Steele novel, a John Grisham novel? Some people certainly find those artful. And so it is, and I'm not trying to say that they're not, but this creates these questions about what it is that makes the art of a piece of writing. And so in the latter half of this chapter, we'll turn to this now, is her asking these questions of the duties of the novelist. And I think this is, for me, the really core thing. And this is on page 146. Novelists must be able to articulate, at least to themselves, a higher or larger goal. And this is relative to just the thing that's happening on the page. We talked about this, that nobody is commanding you to write a book. No one is going to feel that their life has not been worthwhile if you don't publish a book that they read, right? And so we really have to be able to articulate, why am I doing this? What is the point here? What is my purpose? What is the thing that I'm pursuing? And then for several pages she talks about, and this is in the context both of what Tolstoy was doing, and then Zora Neale Hurston, and this idea of what happens on page 149 and 150, the artistic versus didactic novel, right? And where Zora Neale Hurston's goal was to teach readers something, to make us learn or understand something, as Smiley says, to open a window for the mainstream reader upon an unknown or unconsidered segment of society. But here's where those two are similar. The artistic novel, the challenge is that they often fail because readers, the general populace, doesn't feel like they're accessible. There's that exclusivity versus inclusivity. The didactic novel fails because readers don't want to be essentially prescriptively proselytized to. They don't want someone to get up on a soapbox and give them a sermon, right? And so the problem is, how do we think through that question of what it is that we're after? And as she says on page 147, the higher goal each novelist aspires to is always portrayed as a form of truth. And his or her art is meant to more clearly express that truth. So I think the question that you want to ask yourselves is, what is that truth that you are trying to explore and express and get at in your work? That's that higher or larger goal. Okay, and then just the last couple of things. I'm going to let what she writes speak for itself, but I will be interested to see what you think of this idea that for all of that complex, dense stuff, I love that she says on page 153 that art is supposed to be fun. It is the flourishes and the bonuses, the bits of any story that go beyond what everybody knows, that make it fun. In every other category, government, religion, survival, and reproduction, freedom may or may not be present. History is full of conformity and enslavement in the name of politics, faith, production of food and shelter, and child rearing. All of these institutions can exist without freedom, but art cannot. Art is what institutionalizes the basic freedom to make idiosyncratic use of materials, and therefore what institutionalizes freedom. This idea that we utilize art to create something beyond the bounds of expectation and demand. As a result, the novel is always about freedom, and readers of novels have an instinctive understanding of whether the novelist is exercising his freedom or whether he isn't, because the novel is based in the most primal of human materials, emotion and language. I mean, I think that's so important for us to remember as creators, right? That we should be enjoying what we're doing. That art is this freedom, this ability to go outside of the bounds of those genres and categories and approaches that are about survival and necessity. Again, we can argue philosophically about whether art is necessary and what that means, but in terms of just survival, it is not. But it is supposed to be this thing that is fun, that creates the sense of freedom. Um, and then the last thing I want to end on here about this notion of novels as art, and I think this is a really important distinction that we have to always remember. If our various theorists as writers that we've seen here, Tolstoy, Woolf, Trollope, Henry James, even Charles Dickens in this chapter, is the primary question, as she puts it, is not what's good. What do I think is good? Any novel reader can answer this question, and it is inevitable that one good novel will lead to another. That reading many novels, which all inevitably contrast with one another and have different ways of appealing to a reader, will teach her not only what she likes, but also what there is to like and why. But again, this comes back to this question of not there is no universal, objective, good thing in terms of art. There is only what do I think is good, and pursuing that in your writing. And thinking, I think it's worth it to continue thinking about which of these writers that she has overviewed for us in terms of their thoughts on the role of the novel and its art. Which one do I align with, and how is that appearing and expressing itself in the work that I'm doing? Okay, that's all I've got. Look forward to seeing what you all have to say.